I was kidnapped as a teenager and my father supposedly went bankrupt paying the ransom. 20 years later, I found the ransom money sitting in a trust fund managed by my mother. She didn't save me. She and my father staged the whole thing to steal my grandfather's fortune. The dust in my parents' attic has always tasted like failure. It's a thick gray powder that settles in my throat, reminding me with every breath that I am the reason we are all drowning. As I knelt on the cold plywood floor, my knees aching, I wasn't looking for a life-altering secret. I was looking for a recipe for lemon pound cake. My mother had asked for it with that frail, trembling sigh she uses. The one that makes me feel like I've personally stolen the joy from her life. She's been skipping meals again, or so she tells me when I drop off my weekly grocery delivery, pointing to her protruding collarbones as if they were evidence in a court of law. I live in a one-bedroom apartment where the heater rattles like a dying engine and the windows let in more cold than they keep out. I work 10-hour shifts at the warehouse followed by 4 hours of freelance data entry. Also, I can hand over 60% of my paycheck to the people who gave everything to bring me home. For 20 years, I've walked through life with my head down, carrying the $5 million price tag of my survival like a ball and chain. Every time I see my father in that same brown wool coat, the one with the frayed cuffs and the missing middle button, I feel a wave of nausea. He's wore that coat since I was 15. He tells me it's a reminder of what we lost, a badge of a middle-class life traded for a daughter's life. The guilt isn't just a feeling, it's my entire identity. I remember the day I came back. The cameras, the crying, the way my father looked aged by a decade in just 2 weeks. They told me the kidnappers were greedy, heartless men who took every penny of the family savings and then demanded more. I grew up believing that my existence had bankrupted my bloodline. I stopped asking for new shoes in high school. I worked through college to pay my own way, and even then I felt like a thief for spending money on a textbook instead of giving it to my impoverished parents. Tonight was supposed to be the anniversary ritual. It's the somber date in October when we sit in their cramped kitchen, lit by a single dim bulb to save on electricity, and celebrate my return. It's less of a celebration and more of a funeral for their bank account. My father always pours 3 glasses of tap water. He says wine is a luxury for people who didn't have to pay ransoms, and his hands shake so violently the water splashes onto the scarred wooden table. "The men in masks," he whispered this year, his voice cracking like dry parchment. I can still hear them laughing on the phone when I told them I was emptying the last of our retirement. "I'd do it again, honey. I'd live in the dirt for you." I reached across the table and squeezed his hand, my heart breaking for this broken man. I felt a surge of love so intense it hurt. I vowed right then to pick up a 3rd job. I had to make it up to them. I had to pay back the debt that could never be settled. But then came the attic. My mother claimed her memory was fading. Another symptom of the stress she's carried since my kidnapping, and she couldn't remember where she put her father's old recipe box. My grandfather, a man of stern principles and deep pockets, had died shortly after I was returned. The story I was always told was that the grief of my abduction had literally stopped his heart. He was a wealthy man, a developer who owned half the downtown strip, but the chaos of the kidnapping, the legal fees, and the bad investments made in a panic had supposedly swallowed his entire estate before he passed. We were left with nothing but his old Bible and a cedar chest full of moth-eaten memories. I found the chest tucked under a pile of yellowed newspapers from that year. The headlines still screamed, "Heiress returned, family broken." I pushed the papers aside and dragged the heavy cedar box into the light of the lone attic window. As I rummaged through the layers of wool blankets and old photographs, my fingers brushed against a seam in the wood that felt off. It wasn't a recipe box. It was a false bottom, expertly crafted but slightly warped by the humidity. With a splintering crack, the wood gave way. I expected old letters or maybe a forgotten heirloom. Instead, I found a sleek silver tablet, the kind that costs more than my car, and a leather-bound ledger from a private firm in the Cayman Islands. My breath hitched. We were supposed to be a family that couldn't afford a new toaster, yet here was high-end tech hidden in a graveyard of poverty. I turned the tablet on. It wasn't locked. The first thing that loaded was a bank portal. My eyes blurred as I tried to make sense of the numbers. It was a trust fund. A massive, staggering trust fund in my mother's maiden name. The date of its creation? October 17th, exactly 3 days after I was dropped off at a gas station by my captors. I began to scroll, my hands now shaking for a very different reason than my father's. I found digital scans of my grandfather's original will. I read the words slowly over and over. He hadn't lost his money in bad investments. He had stipulated that his fortune was to be held in a strict trust, only accessible to his children in the event of a catastrophic family emergency, or upon his death. Then I saw the wire transfers. The $5 million. It was all there, laid out in a cold digital trail of breadcrumbs. The money hadn't been wired to a shadowy kidnapper in a foreign country. It had been moved from my grandfather's estate into a holding account for a shell company called Apex Management. I did a quick search on the tablet's history. Apex Management was registered to an office park in the next county over. The primary officer? My father. The room began to spin. Every memory of the last 20 years started to rewrite itself in my mind. I thought of the basement where I was kept. The damp smell, the fear, the way the masked man knew I liked peanut butter crackers. I realized now why the kidnapper never hurt me. I realized why they never called the police until after the money was paid. I wasn't a victim of a crime. I was the centerpiece of a fraudulent performance. My parents didn't lose their fortune to save me. They used me as a crowbar to pry the wealth out of my grandfather's dying hands. They staged my abduction, terrified me for 14 days, and let me live in a state of perpetual trauma for 2 decades, all so they could bypass a will and secure a fortune they didn't want to wait for. I looked down at the ledger again. There were recent entries. Massive withdrawals for international real estate and luxury consulting. While I was skipping my own dental appointments to send them money for medicine, they were shopping for villas. I wasn't their daughter. I was a long-term investment. I was a transaction that was still paying dividends 20 years later. The weight I had been carrying wasn't a debt of love. It was the stolen loot of a heist, and I was the one who had been robbed the most. The attic air felt thinner now, as if the oxygen was being sucked out by the weight of the digital truth glowing in my hands. I sat on my heels, the tablet's blue light casting long skeletal shadows against the rafters, and I let my mind drift back to that damp basement 20 years ago. I had lived in that memory every day of my life, but I had always viewed it through the lens of a survivor's gratitude. Now the filter was gone. I remembered the third night of my captivity. I had been sobbing in the corner of a windowless room, my throat raw from screaming, when a man in a dark balaclava slid a small orange package across the concrete floor. It was a specific brand of peanut butter crackers. The square ones with the ridged edges that I used to eat by the boxful when I was an anxious child. At 15 they were my ultimate comfort food. I remember thinking, through my haze of terror, that perhaps my kidnapper had a shred of humanity. I thought it was a miracle, a small mercy from a stranger. But as I sat in the dust of the attic, the realization turned my stomach. Only one person knew those crackers were the only thing I could swallow when my nerves were frayed. My mother used to tuck them into my backpack before every math test and every piano recital. The man behind the mask hadn't been a merciful stranger. He had been a contractor following a grocery list provided by my own parents. The terror I felt back then, the shaking limbs, the nightmares that still wake me up in a cold sweat, wasn't just a byproduct of their greed. It was a prop in their play. I didn't storm downstairs. I didn't scream. A strange, glacial calm settled over me. The kind that comes when you realize you are no longer playing by the rules of a game you never knew you were in. If they could play a part for 2 decades, I could play one for a few days. I tucked the tablet and the ledger back into the false bottom of the cedar chest, carefully smoothing the newspapers over the wood until the attic looked exactly as it had when I entered. I walked downstairs, handed my mother the lemon pound cake recipe I'd eventually found in a different box, and watched her give me that practiced, weary smile. "Thank you, dear," she whispered, her voice thin and frail. "You're such a good daughter. I don't know what we'd do without you." For the first time I didn't feel a surge of warmth. I felt a chill that settled deep in my marrow. The following Tuesday I took a sick day from the warehouse. I waited in my car around the corner from my parents' rental until I saw my mother emerge. She was wearing her charity outfit, a faded cardigan with a loose thread and a pair of scuffed shoes that she'd owned for years. She looked like a woman who had been beaten down by life. I followed her, keeping 3 cars back, expecting her to pull into the local soup kitchen where she supposedly volunteered. Instead, she drove 20 miles out of town to a neighboring county. She parked in front of a boutique where the mannequins in the window wore dresses that cost more than my annual rent. I watched from across the street as she stepped out of the car. Her posture changed. The slight slouch, the weary drag of her feet. It all vanished. She walked into that store with the confidence of a queen. Creeping closer, I peered through the glass. My mother was draped in a shimmering silk scarf, preening in front of a gold-leafed mirror. When it came time to pay, she didn't pull out the crumpled $5 bills I usually saw her counting at the grocery store. She reached into a hidden velvet-lined pocket of that shabby purse and pulled out a sleek black credit card. She swiped it without even looking at the price. The contrast was sickening. The woman in the mirror wasn't my grieving mother. She was a predator enjoying the spoils of a 20-year hunt. I needed more. I waited until Thursday evening, knowing they were going to a free community cinema night. I used my spare key to slip into their house. The air smelled of the cheap lavender soap they used to maintain the illusion of their humble life. I went straight to my father's hobby room, a small den filled with old maps and car magazines. Behind a large framed poster of a 1965 Mustang, I felt the wall. My fingers found a small indentation. A hidden compartment swung open, revealing a second smartphone, fully charged and humming with life. I scrolled through the messages. There were hundreds of them, all exchanged with a man named Eduardo. They were discussing blueprints, soil samples, and marble finishes for a villa on the Spanish coast. The daughter is still sending the monthly checks. One message from my father read. It's not much, but it covers the landscaping costs for the estate. We'll be ready to relocate by spring. We'll tell her we're moving to a cheaper assisted living facility in another state and then just vanish. They weren't just stealing my money. They were planning to erase themselves from my life once they had squeezed every last drop of utility out of my guilt. The rage finally broke through the ice. It wasn't loud. It was a quiet, vibrating hum in my ears. I invited them to my apartment the following night for a thank you dinner. I spent my last $20 on a box of cheap pasta and a jar of basic sauce, setting the table with the mismatched plates I'd used for years to save every cent for them. As we sat down, the heater in my apartment gave a pathetic groan and died. My father hugged his tattered coat tighter. "It's all right, honey," he said, his voice full of that fake, noble suffering. "We're used to the cold. We gave up the luxury of heat a long time ago so you could have a life." "Did you?" I asked, my voice as flat as a grave. He started his usual speech, the one about the bankrupting wire transfers and the masked men. I let him get to the part where he talked about the sacrifice of a father's heart. Then I reached under my chair and placed the Cayman Islands ledger and the silver tablet directly onto the table, right next to his bowl of watery pasta. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched the blood drain from my father's face, his skin turning a waxy, translucent gray. He looked at the ledger, then at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He tried to reach for it, but his hand was shaking, this time with genuine, unadulterated fear. My mother didn't gasp. She didn't cry. She simply put her fork down with a slow, deliberate click against the ceramic. The mask she had worn for 20 years didn't just slip. She took it off. Her eyes, usually so soft and pleading, became as hard as flint. The frail woman disappeared, replaced by someone cold, calculating, and entirely unrecognizable. "You were always too curious for your own good," she said, her voice dropping an octave, losing its shaky, elderly tremor. "Your grandfather was a stingy, arrogant man who was going to let us rot in his shadow for another 2 decades while he sat on a mountain of gold. We just brought the inevitable forward. You got back safe, didn't you? You lived. You had a roof over your head. You kidnapped me," I whispered, the words feeling heavy in my mouth. "You terrified your own child for money." "It was a business arrangement," she snapped, the gaslighting beginning. She leaned forward, her face inches from mine. "That trust fund is your inheritance, really. We're just managing it. We did this for your future." I looked at the tablet, flicking it open to the messages about the Spanish villa and the withdrawals for the silk scarves. "The future in Spain? The one where you leave me here in this cold apartment while you disappear with his fortune?" The look she gave me wasn't one of regret. It was the look of a person who had spent 20 years perfecting a lie and was only annoyed that the curtain had been pulled back too soon. The silence in my freezing apartment was thick, heavy with the weight of my mother's cold admission. I watched them walk out the door that night, their shadows lengthening against the hallway carpet, and for a moment, I felt a familiar urge to apologize, to run after them and beg for the lie back. But the warmth of that blind devotion was gone, replaced by a searing, analytical clarity. I knew that simply calling the local authorities about a 20-year-old kidnapping would be a gamble. Memories fade, evidence disappears, and the statute of limitations is a cruel gatekeeper for those seeking justice for old wounds. I needed something sharper, something current that they couldn't wiggle away from. I spent the next 3 nights huddled under a blanket, the silver tablet's light burning into my retinas as I combed through the digital archives of my grandfather's final weeks. That's when I found the discrepancy, the small incident that changed everything. My grandfather had been in a medically induced stupor during his final 48 hours, yet his digital signature had been used to authorize 3 massive transfers and a codicil to his will. My father hadn't just staged a kidnapping. He had sat by a dying man's bedside and used his limp thumb to unlock a biometric device, effectively stealing the identity of a man who could no longer fight back. This wasn't just a family secret. It was a multi-layered financial fraud that was still technically active because the trust was still being managed under those fraudulent terms. I reached out to Arthur, a retired estate lawyer who spent his mornings at the library where I did my second job. Over lukewarm coffee in a corner booth of a quiet diner, I laid out the ledgers and the timestamps. Arthur's eyes, usually clouded by age, sharpened as he looked at the signatures. "This isn't just theft, kid," he whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of professional disgust and paternal pity. "This is a felony that restarts every time they draw a cent from that fraudulent well." We spent weeks documenting the flow of money, every penny they had siphoned from my grandfather's legacy while I was working double shifts to buy them bread. We mapped out the shell companies, the offshore holding accounts, and the paper trail leading directly to that half-built villa in Spain. The time for quiet observation ended on a rainy Tuesday. Using the administrative access codes I'd pulled from the tablet, I initiated a formal freeze on all accounts tied to Apex Management. I filed it under the emergency suspicion of elder financial exploitation statutes, acting as my grandfather's legal secondary heir. I didn't tell them. I wanted them to feel the sudden jarring snap of the trap. I followed them to an upscale bistro 3 towns over, the kind of place where the waiters wear white gloves and the menu doesn't list prices. I sat in my battered sedan across the street, watching through the window. They looked so comfortable, my father laughing as he swirled a glass of expensive red wine, my mother elegantly cutting into a steak that cost more than my weekly groceries. When the check arrived, my father produced the black card with a flourish. I watched the waiter disappear, then return a minute later with a confused expression. Then came the manager. The panic was visible even from 50 yards away. My father stood up, his face turning a blotchy purple as he shouted, gesturing wildly, while my mother scrambled to find another card in her shabby purse, only to find that one declined as well. For the first time they were experiencing the hollow, gut-wrenching terror of being truly penniless. They were escorted out like common thieves, standing on the sidewalk in the rain, looking exactly like the paupers they had pretended to be for 20 years. The climax came a week later. I sent them a single text message with a GPS coordinate. It was the public park where I had been snatched 2 decades ago, the exact spot where my childhood had ended. It was a gray, biting afternoon. The swings creaked in the wind, sounding like rusted hinges on a coffin. My father arrived looking like a ghost, his tattered coat now seeming less like a costume and more like a shroud. He tried to reach for my hand, his voice a pathetic whine. "Honey, please, there's been a mistake at the bank. We need your help. Think of the family loyalty. Think of everything we went through together." I pulled my hand back as if his skin were made of acid. "Loyalty died in that basement, Dad," I said, my voice steady and cold. "Every time you watched me cry over a bill I couldn't pay, every time you let me apologize for being alive, you killed a little more of that loyalty. It's gone. There's nothing left but the numbers." I laid out the folder Arthur and I had compiled, the evidence of the identity theft, the photos of the villa, and the records of the fraudulent signatures. I gave them the ultimatum. They had 2 hours to sign a legal surrender of all remaining assets. The money would be transferred to a national foundation for victims of domestic kidnapping and child exploitation. They would be left with nothing but their social security and the clothes on their backs. If they refused, I would walk across the street to the federal building and hand the file to a prosecutor who was already on standby. You wouldn't, my mother hissed, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. We are your parents. We gave you life. You used my life as a paycheck, I countered. Sign the papers or spend your retirement in a federal cell. They signed. The scratch of the pen on the paper was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. My mother threw the pen at my feet, her eyes burning with a hatred so deep it felt physical. She didn't offer a hug or a final plea for forgiveness. She just turned her back, her silence confirming that she never loved the daughter. Only the leverage. The resolution was bitter, but it was honest. They were forced to sell the secret properties and move into a state-funded senior housing unit. A cramped, one-bedroom apartment with linoleum floors and yellowing walls. It was exactly the kind of modest life they had lied about having while they were actually millionaires. Now the lie had become their reality. They were living the truth they had authored for me, stuck in a cycle of counting pennies and waiting for a bus that never seemed to come on time. Walking away from that park, I felt a strange, quiet lightness in my chest. It wasn't the explosive joy I'd imagined, but rather a slow, steady release of pressure. The invisible debt was cancelled. I went to a department store and bought a coat. A heavy navy blue wool coat that actually fit my shoulders and kept out the wind. I went to a diner and ordered a full meal, eating every bite without calculating how many hours of overtime it cost me. I used the small portion of my grandfather's original estate, the part they hadn't managed to touch because it was tied to a different, smaller trust, to enroll in the university program I'd dreamed of at 18. I bought a small house with a porch that catches the morning sun. Every evening I sit out there with a cup of peppermint tea, the scent reminding me of my grandfather's library. The ransom was finally settled. It took 20 years and a lifetime of grief, but the debt is paid. My parents stole my past and they nearly broke my spirit, but as I watch the sun set over my own yard, I realize they can no longer touch my tomorrow. I am finally truly home,